In 1987, the fastest production car in America was not a Ferrari, not a Lamborghini, not a Porsche, not even a Corvette. And that last distinction was particularly pointed because the Corvette was supposed to be America's answer to the world. The fastest production car in America was a Buick, a black turbocharged coupe built in Flint, Michigan, a car wearing a badge that, in 1987, drew no particular attention from performance enthusiasts, a car your dentist might drive to church on Sunday. The Buick Grand National GNX ran 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds. It outpaced Porsches at the stoplight. It outran Ferrari Testarossas on the drag strip. It beat the Corvette, GM's own performance flagship, in a straight line. General Motors knew exactly how fast it was. They published a lower number anyway. To understand what the GNX represented, you need to understand where Buick stood in the American automotive market in the early 1980s. Buick was not a performance brand. It occupied a specific and unglamorous position in GM's lineup, above Chevrolet, below Cadillac, appealing to buyers who wanted comfort, quietness, and insulation from the road. It was a brand associated with a particular demographic. Performance was simply not part of the conversation. The broader context made things worse. The oil crises of the 1970s had decimated American performance cars. Emissions regulations had tightened steadily through the decade. By the early 1980s, Detroit's performance output had collapsed. The Corvette was producing around 200 horsepower. Base Mustangs were running 4-cylinder engines. The American performance industry had been hollowed out by a combination of regulation, fuel costs, and insurance surcharges. Against that backdrop, Buick's engineers were doing something that attracted very little attention. In 1978, Buick bolted a turbocharger onto a 3.8-liter V6 and became one of the first American manufacturers to offer a turbocharged production car since the early 1960s. The early results were uneven. The technology was still rough, the power delivery inconsistent. But the platform existed, and the engineers continued refining it year after year, with limited resources and limited corporate attention. By 1984, that work had produced the Buick Grand National, all black, no chrome, no color options. A dark, purposeful coupe that looked out of place in a Buick showroom. It was genuinely fast by the standards of 1984. But it was not yet the finished product. The next step required outside help. In 1987, General Motors commissioned McLaren Performance Technologies, an American boutique engineering firm based in Troy, Michigan, with no connection to the British racing manufacturer, to take the Grand National and rebuild it as a dedicated performance vehicle. The result was the GNX, Grand National Experimental. McLaren replaced the standard turbocharger with a larger Garrett T3 unit, fitted with a ceramic impeller wheel. Ceramic runs lighter than metal, spools faster, and reduces turbo lag. The intercooler was upgraded and rerouted to deliver cooler, denser charge air to the engine. Fuel injectors were replaced. The exhaust system was redesigned. The engine management was recalibrated. The transmission was reinforced for the increased torque load. Suspension geometry was revised and lowered. The rear of the car was widened with functional fender flares to accommodate 245-section rear tires. The finished product looked nothing like a Buick was supposed to look. Low, wide, entirely black, with no chrome trim and no color alternatives. It was a visually aggressive car that happened to carry a Buick badge. GM published an official horsepower figure of 276 with 360 pound-feet of torque. That number was almost certainly not accurate. The question is straightforward. Why would an automaker deliberately publish a power figure lower than the actual output of its own car? There were 2 reasons, and both reflect how the American auto industry operated in that era. In the 1980s, factory horsepower ratings had direct financial consequences for buyers. Insurance companies used those figures to calculate premiums. Higher horsepower meant higher premiums, often substantially. GM's target buyer for the GNX was a performance enthusiast who understood what the car was. Publishing an accurate higher power figure would have driven up insurance costs and suppressed sales. GM kept the published number low, kept premiums manageable, and said nothing. The second reason was internal. General Motors operated under an unwritten but well-understood hierarchy. No GM production car was to officially outperform the Corvette. The Corvette was the company's performance flagship, and that position was protected across divisions. The 1987 Corvette carried an official rating of 240 horsepower. Had GM published accurate GNX figures in the range of 300 to 320 horsepower, a Buick, the brand associated with comfort-oriented buyers, would have officially outperformed the company's top performance car. That outcome was not acceptable to GM's management, so the figure became 276. The test results told a different story. Every major publication that evaluated the GNX in 1987, Road and Track, Motor Trend, Car and Driver, returned performance data that did not correspond to a 276 horsepower car. 0 to 60, 4.7 seconds. Quarter mile, 13.4 seconds at 102 miles per hour. Those were figures that matched the Ferrari Testarossa, a mid-engine Italian exotic with a flat 12 engine, priced at over $110,000. The GNX stickered at $29,000. Engineers and journalists noted the discrepancy immediately. Subsequent dyno testing of original GNX engines has placed actual output in the range of 300 to 320 horsepower at the crank, with some examples showing higher depending on condition and factory boost settings. The specific number varies. What does not vary is that GM's published figure was knowingly inaccurate and was never corrected. General Motors built 547 GNXs. The last Grand National and the last GNX came off the line in December 1987. There was no second generation, no follow-up, no successor. The engineers who had spent nearly a decade developing that turbocharged V6 watched the line go quiet. The G-body platform had been scheduled for discontinuation. New platforms and new priorities were coming. The turbocharged V6 program did not fit the company's forward plan, and GM walked away from it. The questions that raises are uncomfortable to sit with. What would a 1990 GNX have looked like with another development cycle? What could have been done with a larger budget, a newer platform, and active corporate support? There are no answers to those questions. The program ended and the engineering team dispersed. What happened to the cars themselves was not something GM's planners anticipated. The 547 GNXs became collector vehicles almost immediately. The combination of verifiable real-world performance, extreme production rarity, and the improbability of their existence, a car that could match Ferrari on a drag strip, sold out of a Buick dealership, created a lasting reputation in the performance community. That reputation has only grown with time. Clean, well-documented GNXs now sell at auction for $100,000 to $150,000. That is a car that left the dealership for $29,000. Appreciation of 400% or more in a market where most vehicles lose half their value in the first few years of ownership. Low-mileage, unmodified examples have crossed $200,000 at Barrett-Jackson. A Buick, worth more at auction than a new Porsche 911. The GNX is a performance car story. It is also a story about institutional behavior. A small team of Buick engineers, working with an equally small group at McLaren Performance Technologies, built something that the broader automotive world had not anticipated. A turbocharged V6 that was competitive with the best European exotic cars of its era. They did it without significant budgets, without a prestigious platform, and without corporate enthusiasm behind them. When the work was finished, their own company declined to be accurate about what it had achieved. GM published a horsepower figure it knew was wrong. It protected the Corvette's internal standing at the expense of the factual record. The engineers who built the GNX watched their work get quietly downplayed because of where Buick sat on the organizational chart. That is a familiar dynamic. Large organizations, even those containing skilled, motivated people doing serious work, often act in ways that undermine their own results. The GNX was a case where the product exceeded what the institution was prepared to publicly acknowledge. The car warranted honest marketing, continued development, and direct acknowledgement of what it was. Instead, it received one model year, a falsified specification sheet, and a quiet discontinuation. The record has been corrected by the market and by 4 decades of sustained interest from the collector and performance communities. Every serious automotive historian knows what the GNX was. The 547 cars that were built are preserved, sought after, and valued at a level that reflects their actual significance. not the significance GM chose to assign them at the time. The story of how Buick built the fastest production car in America and how General Motors deliberately obscured that fact remains one of the more telling episodes in the history of the American auto industry. If you encounter a black 1987 Buick Grand National GNX, and that is a rarer occurrence every year, it is worth a moment of attention. You are looking at one of 547 cars, a car that outran Ferrari, built by engineers no one expected to produce it, sold by a company that suppressed the actual performance numbers and never corrected the record. Officially rated at 276 horsepower, actually producing somewhere between 300 and 320, by a company that knew the difference from the day the car left the factory. Nearly 40 years later, the question it leaves behind is simple. What would it have cost General Motors to just publish the accurate number? If this story hit different, subscribe. We go deep on the cars, the decisions, and the secrets that Detroit buried. New video every week.